Globespan is a Guyanese dialogue moving towards the realization of one nation in one Guyana. It's a platform that offers an all-inclusive discussion with the pros, the cons, the ones that is taken aside, and the ones that stand in the middle. Globespan believes agreeing and disagreeing are part of the nation's building.
She is a beauty, beautiful Guyana, with wonderful people all over this country.
Globespan believes every Guyanese voice is part of the nation's building. As we span the globe for voices from the diaspora and those living home, we stand on our commitment that we are all Guyanese working towards one nation in one Guyana. As the world turns on its axis bringing changes, we as Guyanese must adapt to those changes for a better Guyana for all. Globespan stands on its axis with its belief that one nation, one Guyana, one destiny must include voices from all corners of Guyana.
With many flavor, 6 different people blended together. Raise your flag high in unity, we're family with one destiny. Raise your flag high in unity.
Good night to all our listeners far and wide, in Guyana, in the Caribbean, in the United States, and around the world. Tonight, we have as our guest Dr. David Hinds. But before I get to him, let me say this. Very special thanks to Noir Singh for making this program available, and to Devin Bissoon and Ryan Gobin as well, our technical directors. Now, the views expressed tonight by our guests are solely those of his, and does not represent the staff or management of Globespan Television. We can be heard on Facebook and YouTube as well, and all other social networks. So welcome to Globespan Television tonight, and let me say a special human holidays to all our friends in Guyana and around the world, because today is a human holiday in Guyana, I think, and special holiday to all of them. Now, Dr. Hinds, as we have here tonight, is our special guest. Dr. Hinds is a professor, I think it's at Arizona State University. He's also the head of podcast Politics 101. He is also the senior member of the WPA, Working People's Alliance Party, and now he is the presidential candidate. And since we had all the leaders of the party, so decided to bring Dr. Hinds on to express to our viewers what he intends to do. Good night, Dr. Hinds. Welcome to our
Good
program.
night, Dr. Rose. It's a pleasure to be on with you. I am not a stranger to Globespan, but of course, I've been on other programs, but it's the first time I've been on a one-on-one with you. Thanks for having me.
Good. Although you've been on Globespan many times, I got a request from one of our listeners to ask you to tell them who you are. In other words, give them a brief background of yourself.
Yeah, that's quite. I try to avoid those questions. I am a country boy. I was born in Buxton, there, and I, became involved in politics at a tender age. I was about, 13, 14, 15. I got involved in village politics. We had something called the Buxton Youth Council, which was a youth version of the village council. And I got involved with that when I was in short pants. And then I heard Walter Rodney in 1974. I was barely about 14 years then, and decided with the permission of my aunt that I wanted to join the Rodney thing. And so I became involved in the village with the WPA. And of course, the rest is history. My life has been really a combination of politics, a cultural activism, and academics. And through that combination, I have been able to express myself and contribute to the struggles of the people in Guyana, and I would say the wider Caribbean.
Good. That's very good. How old is the WPA, Dr. Hinds? And can you tell us why you joined the WPA and not one of the two mainstream parties, the PNC or the PNCR and the PEPC?
The WPA was founded in 1974, a merger of Moses Bhagwan's Indian People's Revolutionary Associate, EUC Guyana's ASCRIA, Clive Thomas's Ratoon, which was based at the University of Guyana, and for a brief moment, the Working People's Vanguard Party, led by Brindley Ben, but they dropped out shortly after the formation. So those four organizations founded the WPA in 1974. It's popularly said that Walter Rodney was a founder member of the WPA. He was not. Walter Rodney came back to Guyana after the WPA was formed and joined the WPA. So he was not a founder member of the WPA. He joined the WPA after he came back in 1974. Why did I join the WPA? Interesting story. My mother migrated, and so my aunt raised us in my mother's absence. And she was heavily involved in the PNC. She was a member of the Women's Auxiliary at that time. That was before the formation of the WRSM. It was called the Women's Auxiliary. And she was very active in our village in that organization. And when Guyana and Burnham fell out in 1971, they parted ways in 1971. Some people in Buxton took sides, and she was one. She took Guyana's side, and so I grew up in a household where Burnham wasn't the hero, so to speak, right? And that was quite unusual. That was quite unusual in Black households. I grew up in a household where Guyana was the hero, not Burnham. And so when I heard Rodney for the first time as a young teenager, and I ran home and told my aunt that, look, this man, Dr. Rodney, came to talk, and I like what he said, and I want to join the thing. She said, you can join once Teacher Sidney is there. Teacher Sidney being Guyana. So, and so therefore, because when we were 1971, 11 years old, we were little children, and I noted that the glasses with Burnham pictures came out from in those old days, you would remember they called it souvenir, came out from the souvenir, and it was in the kitchen. You drank with cups, and the glasses were in the souvenir. And the glass with Burnham picture suddenly in the kitchen. And Burnham's picture, which was on the wall, came down. As kids, we couldn't. But you say, Auntie, why we drinking in this glass? She sucked her teeth, right? That's all she did, right? And as you got older, you came to understand what happened at that moment. So I was in unusual circumstances in the sense that Burnham wasn't my hero as I was growing up. I remember listening to Burnham speaking and being enthralled by it and being very proud that here was a Guyanese who could speak so well and so on. But beyond that, Burnham wasn't the hero for me, for us, for my household. Guyana was the hero. And so it was natural for me then to join the WPA as opposed to the PNC.
Since you're in the Burnham issue, you had some runnings with Burnham. Tell our members what it was all about.
Well, not so much. Well, with the PNC, I mean, the WPA and the PNC became almost like enemies in the 1970s. And that was not confined to Guyana. Eh? The WPA was part of what was called the New Left organizations that came out of the Black Power movement of the late 60s and the early 70s. And they had fundamental differences, these organizations and leaders had fundamental differences with the independence leaders. The independence leaders, of course, having to govern, had decided that, look, you couldn't take on American and the imperialists, and you had to be pragmatic when it came to them. And these new left leaders, the Rodneys, the Tim Hectors, the George Odlums, Trevor Monroe, Rosie Douglas, etc., they were arguing that we needed to make a clean break with imperialism and capitalism. And so it was that tension between the fathers, if you will, and the son, because Burnham was education minister when Rodney got a break to go to Queen's College and so on. So Professor Gordon Rolle said it was really a contestation between the fathers and the sons and daughters, their sons and daughters, as to what the tenor and direction of Caribbean independence should be. And in Guyana, it led to assassination. It led to assassination. That was not the case in the other English-speaking countries. There was near assassination in Grenada. Maurice Bishop's father was killed on the Geary and so on. But in Guyana, it led to assassination. And of course, I was part of the young brigade that joined the Rodney, Guyana thing and so on. And in that regard, we came into contact, into conflict with Mr. Burnham and the PNC. So Burnham famously told us to make our wills, you know. And the two Daddy Crapo can't live in the same place. So the contestation reached that level. And of course, Rodney, Edward Dublin, Owini Kwame from the WPA were assassinated. Many of us were imprisoned. I myself spent 3 years and 3 months in prison when I was a teenager for standing up to Burnham. That history, Dr. Rose, is not well known, especially by our Indo-Guyanese brothers and sisters who see me today and see my politics today and do not realize that, you know, people like myself, we have fought against all governments. We fought against a black government and we were black, right? We fought against the PPP, and even under the coalition, we disagreed. I was fired 2 times by the coalition for standing up to them. I was fired from the Ministry of Social Cohesion, and I was fired from the Chronicle as a columnist and editorial writer. Now, when people call me today a racist, you know, I assume they call me a racist because I'm opposing an Indian government, but I also oppose 2 African-led governments and paid. 1, I paid with my liberty, and 2, I paid with employment. So that is true, I think, for this audience, that they should know that.
I think that's very, very good to clarify that indeed. Was the WPA a leftist party, a Marxist party, a socialist party, or a liberal party?
Well, I suppose all of that. Our program in 1979, we describe ourselves as independent Marxists. And so in that sense, we were leftists, we were socialists. But one of the things that distinguish us from other left parties is that we didn't believe you could build socialism in the circumstances that we were in Guyana. In that sense, we were not dogmatically Marxist. We did not believe in the one-party state, for example. We did not believe in dictatorship of anything. We weren't asked by, I think, the Catholic Standard whether we believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I remember us answering and saying we believe in dictatorship of nothing, right? So although we were a left party, a Marxist party, we were independent. We were independently Marxist. We didn't toe the Soviet line. We didn't toe the Chinese line. Guyana himself, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1958, I think it was, and he opposed it at that time. You know, left-wing people didn't oppose the Soviet Union, and the press asked him, why he opposed, and he said he's a Marxist, but he's a homegrown Marxist. So one could describe the WPA as a kind of West Indian Caribbean Marxism that brought together working class upliftment, Black power, Caribbean integration, all together that make up our Marxism. It wasn't just about the working class. We incorporated race. A lot of Marxists thought race was what they call false consciousness, meaning the WPA didn't believe that. We believe race was real consciousness, that class politics was real consciousness, and that Caribbean integration was very important to the development of our region. So in that sense, we were independent Marxists, independent leftists. I think the Cubans once described us as what they said? They said we were an unpredictable bomb or something like that, something to that effect. Because even the Cubans couldn't make sense of us because of our independence.
Marxist parties don't have a single leader. So the WPA could have been classified as a Marxist because it did not have a single leader. Am I right to say that?
Yes, although Marxist Party said they didn't have a single leader, they do. The General Secretary was often the leader. The General Secretary of the Soviet Union was the president. The General Secretary of the PPP was the leader of the PPP. We had what we call a collective leadership. So that there was no single leader. Later on, we modified that. We had a two-person co-leadership. And then at some point, I think it was 4. But we had a co-leadership rather than a single leader. Walter Rodney was never elected the leader of the WPA. He was the leader of the wider opposition pro-democracy movement. And the people conferred on him leadership of the movement and the party. But inside the party, he was just an ordinary executive member. Of course, if you're Walter Rodney, your voice carries weight within the party, I would imagine. But from a constitutional organizational standpoint, we never had a single leader. We had co-leaders. And to this day, I think we just announced that we just announced 3 co-leaders, Takumo Kunse, Rohit Kanai, and myself as the new co-leaders replacing Drs. Thomas and Rupnarayan.
That's very good to hear. But Rodney came to dominate the party. The party was actually Rodney's party. How did that happen?
Well, because Rodney was a once-in-a-lifetime leader. C.L.R. James has this thesis on leadership. He said, the effective leadership is really a fusion of time, place, and person. Rodney came back to Guyana in 1974. He wasn't tainted with the racial politics of the 1960s. He was gone. He was away studying. So he wasn't part of the ferment of the 1960s. So he came back without that quote-unquote baggage. He came back in 1974 at the time. It was a decade after the PNC had come to power. The PNC had declared the Sophia Declaration, which said that the party was paramount to all institutions of state. This is 1974 time. Right. So Rodney comes back at a particular time. He comes back without the baggage of the 1960s. But most importantly, what C.L.R. James argued is that this leader at this particular time and place must have the capacity to absorb the energies that are there. And Rodney, because of his own academic brilliance, because of his experience in activism in Jamaica, in Africa, he came back. He had the capacity. He understood working class struggle. He understood revolutionary struggles. And so therefore, he had the capacity to absorb that energy, because here what Guyanese was saying, our government is moving towards a dictatorship and we need to do something. And Rodney was able to absorb that energy. Hence, he became the leader of the movement. And by all accounts, according to the people, the leader of the WPA.
That's so true. As you know, Rodney was kicked out of where? I think it was Tanzania. Am I right?
No, he was kicked out of Jamaica.
No, before an African country.
No, but I'm coming to that. He was kicked out of Jamaica in 1968 for wanting to teach African history at the University of the West Indies. They didn't allow him. He went on to the streets and was teaching African history at the street corner. The Jamaicans then banned him, and we know what happened. They were what we call the Rodney riots, as the Jamaicans came onto the streets.
Ushiro was the prime minister who banned him.
Ushiro was the prime minister. Right. He left, he spent a little while in Cuba, and then he went back to Tanzania, where he was from 1969 to 1974. He was not kicked out of Tanzania. He left Tanzania because he felt that, look, I was in a country where I did not belong. I'm an African, but I wasn't born here. There's a limit to what I can do in this country, right? I will better serve the struggle if I go back to my own country. So that's how he went back to Guyana, and he wasn't kicked out. Apparently, if you go by what Comrade Hamilton Green said, that when he went to Tanzania, there were members of the Tanzanian government who relayed to him some disquiet about Rodney, that they felt that he was radical, that he was a revolutionary, and that he was disposed towards changing governments by ways other than election. This is according to Army Green. We don't know whether it's true. What we do know is that when Rodney was in Tanzania, he played a very important role in the left wing in Tanzania, and there were exchanges between himself and members of the Tanzania government, including Julius Nyerere. And there were some disagreements on the way forward. Rodney favored a Marxist working class Pan-Africanism, whereas some of the others favored a statist Pan-Africanism. That is a Pan-Africanism of governments.
Controlled by the state, yeah.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No, I'm done. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the question is, how well do you know Rodney? And can you tell our listeners who Rodney was and what he was like? And let me say this before we start. I want all our listeners to know I could only take so many questions. I already get about 54 questions, but I can't ask Dr. Thomas, Dr. Hinds all these questions. It's impossible. I only have an hour and a half to do the program. So bear with me. I will ask a couple, but bear with me. Go ahead, Dr. Hinds.
Yeah, I met Rodney as a 14-year-old when he came back. And as I said, he came to Buxton to give us a little talk. And we had heard of him because Andrew Salke had written a book about the Rodney riots in 1968. And it was kind of fictional account. And the main character, of course, was Dr. Rodney, and Andrew Salke called him Dr. Buxton. And so here we were, little boys, Guyana had brought the book, and we Buxton in this thing, and this guy is a Guyanese. And so we'd heard of Rodney. And so when he came back, that's when I met him for the first time. I never got very, very close to him because of course, I was from Buxton in the country. He would come in the village and you get to know him, he would talk with us and so on. In 1979, when the whole thing, the civil rebellion burst up, I got relatively close to him. And was able to benefit from chatting with him. I guess I can say it, I was one of the persons that shadowed him um, during that period. And so I got a chance to talk with him a lot and benefit from his advice and his tremendous knowledge. So it was at that political level that I got to know him. And Rodney was the type of person who took an active interest in you as an individual. That is what floored a lot of us as young people. Because here was the great Walter Rodney, and you're there with him, and he's talking to you as David. You know, you were not just a statistic. I remember when in one of his books, I think it was People's Power, No Dictator. Yes, he brought in the manuscript for the book, and I was sitting at the front desk at the WP office in Tiger Bay. And he handed me a copy of it and said, "Can you read this and offer me comments?" No, Dr. Rose, I am I am 19 years old. As we would say, I want to kung si me pants, because what am I? I found out he had given the manuscript to Nigel Westmus, to Karen D'Souza and others. We were all around the same age. And I said, well, I read it. I said, but what am I going to say? Well, at that time, I fancied myself as a cultural person. They do drama and so on. So I put in a sentence on the importance of culture. And that sentence is found its way in the book. But that was the kind of guy. He valued every one of us, you know? And that is my fondest memory of him, quite apart from the public meetings and his explosive rhetoric and so on. It was the fact that he took an active interest in each of us as individuals.
I was told that's how he is indeed. I met him at McGill University, I think was in 1980, February month. He came and gave a 4-day lecture there, and I met him there. Now, Dr. Thomas, why I'm saying Dr. Thomas, Dr. Hinds. Rodney died on June 11th, 1980.
June 13th.
June 13th, sorry. He died because it was told that he was given a walkie-talkie by some GDF corporal or somebody and so forth. Others say he was going to blow up the Brigham
the Camp Street prison.
Camp Street prison. And the bomb blew up on him. Who do you think killed Rodney?
Look, Rodney was murdered under the government of the People's National Congress. He was murdered under their government. And so that government has to take responsibility for his assassination. He was opposing that government, all right? And so that government has to take responsibility for the assassination of Walter Rodney. Whether Burnham knew or Burnham gave the order, I don't know. And I think for our purposes, that is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that the People's National Congress government of the day must take responsibility for Rodney's assassination.
I know he got something on Hatfield Street and he got some building named after him. I think what, Rodney's Heritage Center or Culture Center or something. But
the Rodney Archives is named after him.
Don't you think he should be more a national prominent figure? Something more bigger and better should be named after him?
Yes, I really do think so. But Rodney, like many leaders of that prominence, Rodney is a victim of our internal politics. The PNC, of course, is going to have difficulty in honoring Rodney. We saw when Granger came to power as part of the coalition, he stopped the Rodney inquiry. He was not very nice. Granger was not very nice to the Rodney legacy. Although Rodney's party was part of his coalition. The PPP, on the other hand, tend to use Rodney conveniently. They would use Rodney against the PNC to say, here is this good Negro that you all assassinate, all right? But when it comes to honoring Rodney in a fundamental way, the PPP edges, because the PPP believed that Rodney was adventurous, that he was ultra-leftist, and that his politics were not in sync with their politics. In fact, in 1980, Dr. Jagan, speaking at Grove, said, "Look, Walter Rodney came and promised you all a Christmas present, and all you all got is his body on a platter." Dr. Jagan wasn't kind to Rodney when Rodney was around. He told Rodney, "Don't organize in Indian areas, go organize in Black people areas." Rodney himself is reported, and Guyana reports this, that the three of them were somewhere in Guyana. Jagan was responding to a criticism that Indians were leaving the PPP, and he wanted to assure the comrades that Indians were not leaving the PPP. And I think Rodney was moved to say, "Look, we are fighting a struggle now, but when the struggle is over, people like yourself, we will have to deal with because of your role in the kind of racial politics of the time." So the PPP was not always kind to Rodney. And so while they pay lip service and they use Rodney against the WP, against the PNC, they have never really honored Rodney in any deep and abiding way.
Now, as you know, Rodney was, as you said, the party was Marxist, but Rodney was a socialist. Burnham was a socialist. Jagan said he was a Marxist-Leninist. I don't know what he meant by that. But let's say he was a socialist too. How Rodney's policy is different from the other two leaders, both Burnham and Jagan? All three of them were promoting socialist ideology.
Well, I don't think the differences were ideological, and I think that question that you asked there is the million-dollar question about Guyana, right? Probably the only country in the world where your top three parties are all some kind of Marxist party. You know, the PPP said they were communists, but Burnham said he was Marxist-Leninist, the WP independent Marxist. When the Americans invaded Grenada in 1983, all three parties were in front of the American embassy, picketing, right? So the issue was not ideological in that sense, right? The issue in Guyana came down to the management of political power, the management of the economy. And this was not necessarily tied to any Marxism. It was tied to the particular issues as they present themselves in Guyana. When Burnham nationalized, he got support from Jagan, he got support from the elements that make up the WPA, all right? So there's no disagreement there, all right? Having nationalized, how did the PPP, the PNC, use the new state apparatus that now has a large economic arm? How did it use that power inside of Guyana? All right, and I think that's where Rodney would come into conflict with the PNC. His conflict with the PPP would be on the race question, all right? Because the PPP, for all its Marxism, for all its communism, it benefited from racial mobilization, and it mobilized along race. Rodney did not feel that you should mobilize along race. He felt that Guyana should be what he called a non-racial society. And so therefore, his differences with Jagan was on the question of race, was on the question of a dogmatic Marxism that talks about a one-party state and the dictatorship of the party. And so on. Rodney had no place for that kind of dogmatic politics. So with Burnham, the question was Burnham's management of power, his autocratic management of power. And with the PPP, it was a question of the dogmatism as it relates to leftist politics. It was a question of their attitude to race and racial politics.
Let me ask you a hypothetical question. Had Rodney been alive? Well, let me say this first. I wrote a book on the Caribbean, Dependency and Socialism in the Modern Caribbean. And it says the subtitle is Super Intervention in Guyana, Jamaica, and Grenada. Now, in that book, I interviewed Chady Jagan, I interviewed Hamilton Green, I interviewed Desmond Hoyt, Viola Burnham, and a whole slew of politicians in Guyana. But Hoyt told me, and this is hypothetical, Hoyt told me that when Rodney came to Guyana, all he wanted to do was to teach at UG. And if Burnham would offer him a job to teach at UG and not deny him, he would not have been in opposition or form any party or be part of any movement. Do you believe that?
No, I don't think that is necessarily accurate. I've heard that testimony from a lot of people. There were people in the PNC hierarchy who felt that Rodney should have been given the job at UG. There are people who felt strongly about that. And these were not people who necessarily agreed with Rodney, but they felt he was a brilliant son of Guyana, and at least he should have been teaching at the University of Guyana. I understand efforts were made for him to meet with Burnham. Those efforts were ditched by some people in the hierarchy of the PNC, so that never materialized. Now, you were asking if Rodney had lived, what Guyana might have been, and we can't tell. The one thing I can say about Rodney, based on my study of his writings and from my little conversation with him, he was a person that was a concretist. That is, that he was not afraid that if a situation changed, to change his views. He was a concretist. And all I know is that had Rodney lived, he would have confronted each historical moment based on the context of that moment. There are some people today who say the WPA has strayed from its roots because they want the WPA to remain in the 1970s, where we are hammering Burnham, and that's all we are good for. And this comes mostly from the PPP, right? They're happy with a WPA that is in the 1970s, hammering Burnham. And so for them, all right, once we move away from that moment and we confront other moments, we are betraying Rodney. I think it's a disservice to Rodney. Rodney was a concretist. And if Rodney were alive in Guyana today, I can't tell you what position he would have taken on X issue, Y issue, but I know that he would have confronted the issues in the context of the moment that we are in.
A good book you should write on Rodney is Walter Rodney. I'm giving you the title of the book, A Cultural, Social, and Political Icon. And that book will be sold for sure.
All right, thank you.
That should be one of your projects. Now, it has been said many times that had Rodney lived, they said Guyana would have been different. But many believe that Burnham had no say in killing Rodney. And this was confirmed by many of Burnham's so close friends, because when the old Rodney died, he called in all these people and they start cursing and what have you. As a matter of fact, I was told when the Brigdam, the chief for Brigdam, what do you call the guy who heads the station, security, called him. He cursed the guy, go and find out what's went wrong and let me know, and so forth. But this is what I heard. Now, why would Burnham kill Rodney? If Burnham can show that he can rig elections and with almost 50 seats in parliament, 45 seats in parliament out of 65 against the PEP, do you think Rodney was going to be no match for him in any election?
Well, I don't know. That's hypothetical. I mean, I don't know. Rodney never contested an election,
That
and
is true.
and one cannot answer that question. I've heard the same story that you've heard, that Burnham had nothing to do with the assassination. I have heard that, and I don't know whether that is true or not. As I said, he was assassinated under Burnham's government, and that government has to take responsibility. Whether the leader gave the order, whether the leader knew, it was his government, and he has to take responsibility. If there were other people who committed murder, Burnham never brought them before the courts. All right?
That's true.
So if other people committed this murder without his knowledge, he had the authority to make sure that they were brought before the courts of the murder. It never happened.
Let me just say this to all our listeners and to all those who are listening. When I say Burnham did not know about Rodney's death, I did the research. It was confirmed by 5 to 6 of his senior people. He was there cursing on everybody. Why the hell you kill this every man for? You know what will happen to us and so forth. Unless he was pretending. But 5 to 6 people gave me the same information when he called us. But what do you think went wrong? Who could have done this? And he was asking questions. So 5 or 6 people I interviewed separately cannot make up the same story. And that's my conclusion. Maybe his party is responsible, his government, but maybe he did not know himself. Somebody could have done it for some other reason or reasons. Now, Dr. Hinds, let me turn to you. You now have been, or were you elected or selected to be the presidential candidate for the WPA? Which one is elected? Elected. Okay, good. Why did you accept?
Partly because I felt that our party still has a contribution to make to the development of our country, especially in this new era of the petro state. It is very difficult for a party like ours because we come out of that left-wing revolutionary Marxist tradition. Our reputation was built on multiracialism. That is, that people of the different ethnic groups struggle together and move together. In this era when our country is as divided as it is, there is no multiracial constituency. So there's not a natural constituency for the WPA. There is no revolutionary fervor in the society. People are not flocking to public demonstrations and coming onto the streets and shouting people's power. And so there's no revolutionary constituency. So for a party like ours, we have to be constantly looking at what's happening and trying to, in a sense, rejiggle our party, trying to bring our party into the present. Because the PNC and the PPP are electoral machineries. And so once there are elections, those parties will survive because they are about fielding candidates, winning elections, and governing. The WPA comes out of a different tradition. It's a tradition that says that, look, we have to transform our politics. We have to bring about revolutionary change in the society. And so, therefore, our reason for being is different. Now, when you come into this era, like I said, there's no revolutionary fervor in the society. There's no multi-ethnic, multiracial constituency in the country. Then the party has to reposition itself to deal with the present. And we have been, in the last decade or so, studying the situation, advancing positions that we feel are consistent with the present. And I have been part of that drive in the party. And I suppose the party thinks that there is some connection between our party and the masses of people in Guyana, that there are pockets or there are tendencies in the society that we tend to represent, that we tend to speak for. And the fact that I've been out there as one of the leading faces and voices of the party felt that I could be the standard bearer. Now, I come from a tradition of politics, which in which I don't think that you have to be the leader in order to make change. In that sense, I'm Guyanite. I'm Guyanite at heart in terms of my political upbringing. All right, that I don't see politics through the lens of leader, and so it took some doing to convince me to accept being the standard bearer of the party. And the pressure came not so much from within the party, but from outside of the party. In my own village, Buxton, in villages that I go to, people recently were, in many regards, getting very angry at me. David, why are you promoting Nigel Hughes and Aubrey North, and not promoting yourself? You know, people were literally cursing me out. And so that pressure on the party from outside, mainly, but also from, I guess, inside our ranks, convinced me that I should accept the challenge.
Are you dual citizenship, dual citizen?
No. I am a Guyanese citizen. I've never changed my citizenship. I've traveled on a Guyanese passport. No, I knew when I left Guyana. When I left Guyana, it was because my mother, who lived near to Howard University, she migrated in the 60s. And she lived down the road from Howard University. And she would go there to catch the bus. And in her head, one of her children has to go to Howard University. She always had that crazy idea in her head. And so at some point she asked Brother UC permission for me and my brother to come to America to spend time with our siblings who were growing up without knowing us, and also for me to go to Howard. Guyana granted permission. So my plan was to come, go to Howard, get a bachelor's degree, and say, Mommy, I have fulfilled what you dreamt of, and I'm gone. All right? Well, I came, bachelor's degree led to master's degree, led to PhD, led to teaching at university, and so I'm here. But I vowed that once I was finished studying, I would spend part of my time in Guyana doing political work and part of my time working in America. And I've been doing that from 1997 to the present. I spend 4 or 5 months per year. I just came back from Guyana. I spent 4 months there, right? May, June, July, August. I do that every year. I go back at Christmas time. I spend another month and a half. And in between, I go in and so on. So I spend about 5.5 months per year in Guyana. And I knew I wanted to be involved in Guyanese politics. And so I couldn't become a citizen of another country. I felt it was not morally correct. No, that was long before the law was made that says you can't participate in being a parliamentarian and so on. I worked that out on my own. I didn't need a law, all right? And so many people, understandably so, after spending as long as I have spent in the United States, obviously believe that I'm an American citizen. No, I'm not. I'm a Guyanese citizen. Never change.
But if you have to be the presidential candidate and you have to campaign, you need at least to spend a year in Guyana campaigning. Would you be able to take time out from your work to do that?
We will work that out. We'll work that out. In these days, I'm sitting right here campaigning, okay. With social media, you don't have to be on the ground 365 days per year to do campaigning. But I get your point. We'll have to spend time on the ground doing campaigning. I've done that in the past. I campaigned as a candidate for the APNU in 2011 and again in 2015 and in 2020. I participated fully in those 3 campaigns.
Your friend Nigel Hughes became the leader of the AFC. I think was on June 28th at their convention or conference or whatever you call it. And since then, he has been crisscrossing the country. He has been all over Essequibo, Demerara, Berbice, all over the country, campaigning as if elections are being held this year. I don't think he spent a day in the courtroom since he became leader, but I'm guessing. Now, he's campaigning, telling people there's a new AFC under his leadership. And his motto is, better must come, which is a Bob Marley song, I think. Now, don't you think you should follow Nigel's footsteps to promote the WPA?
Yes, and I do that every day. I'm on social media platform, Politics 101, 5 days per week. I do that among other things. And we've been doing that, like I said, since over the last 4 years. So we have been doing our fair share of campaigning. We have gone into communities at particular moments. But you're right. That campaigning has to intensify on the ground, and we are about to start doing that very shortly.
Give me a prediction. How many seats do you expect the WPA to win?
I don't know. I don't know. We don't do polls in Guyana, Dr. Rose. And
No, that's not true. Polls are being conducted in Guyana, but you don't know the polls.
We don't know the polls, right? Well, I was going to say, political parties do polls, their own internal polls. I don't expect the PNC to poll to find out how many seats WPA is going to get. I don't expect the AFC to do that. To do that. And I know other interests may be doing polls. We are not privy to what those polls are saying. So I cannot sit here and say how many seats we are likely to get if we were to contest an election on our own. What I do know is that the AFC, the PNC, and the WPA are really contesting in the same constituency. Because in many regards, the Indo-Guyanese constituency is being locked off from the opposition parties. Yes, we can hold meetings, but I don't think that the PPP is in a mood to allow any encroachment in the Indian Guyanese constituency. So it will be very difficult for us. It's not impossible for us to get votes from the Indian Guyanese constituency.
No,
but it will be very, very difficult.
I can tell you this, though. In 2011 and in 2015, the AFC got 70% of the votes from Indo-Guyanese districts, especially up to Quarantine Region 6. Dr. Meyer was there with them, and he's known as a Zara Berbice, very popular Berbice. The AFC, I think in 2011, the AFC had 33,000 votes, and almost 19,000 came from Berbice and other regions, Indo-Guyanese votes. And in 2015, I think it's about the same number, it's about the same percentage, but the numbers were lower.
Yes, you're correct about that. I usually refer to them as Nagamutu votes.
Okay.
The Nagamutu factor, I think, was very important in Indian Guyanese voting for the AFC. Remember in 2006, when Raphael Trotman was the presidential candidate, the AFC votes came from African Guyanese. In fact, the PNC was reduced to its lowest electoral returns ever, 34%. And the number of seats that it lost mirrored the number of seats that the AFC got. That changed in 2011 once the candidate became Ramjatan and Nagamutu came over. So I think the Nagamutu factor is very important in understanding what the AFC was able to accomplish among Indian Guyanese in 2011, 2015. Because in the minds of Indian Guyanese, they weren't going from the PPP to an African party. They're going to an Indian party. So they created in their minds the AFC as an alternative Indo-Guyanese party in the AFC. And I think that's where the fallout came. I don't think my AFC brothers and sisters understood race and understood that dynamic. I think if they understood why they got Indian Guyanese votes, they would have been able to hold on. But I don't think they understood it. They don't think, because remember, some of our political leaders don't like dealing with race. You know, they avoid race. And I think our comrades in the AFC made that error of not realizing the Indian Guyanese vote for them was a racial vote, not racist. I'm not talking about racial in the sense that they were creating an alternative Indian Guyanese party. And so whatever decisions you make, you have to take that into consideration. And I don't think they fully took that into consideration. And those Indian Guyanese comrades went back to the PPP. And now with the PPP in power, with the power of money, the power of coercion, it's very difficult to get Indian Guyanese crossing the frog. It's not impossible. It's not impossible, but I think it's a heavy lift. And so, for all intents and purposes, the opposition parties have to look to the Amerindian constituency and the African Guyanese constituency for the bulk of its votes.
And the mixed race, which is
and well, you know, the mixed race, as you will know, Dr. Rose, I would say more than 75% of the mixed race really vote Black, historically, right?
In the last election, the last two elections, it was over 90%.
There you go. There you go. You have the numbers more than me. So I don't pay too much of attention to the term mix, because you know, you grow up and you know they have straight-haired Douglas and they have a hard-haired Douglas, right? And straight-haired Douglas would socialize as Indians, hard-haired Douglas as socialize as Africans. That's just the reality in our country. Yeah. But the mix are really the red-skinned people.
Okay.
It's really the redskin, you know, middle class, mixed up with Portuguese, African, sometimes a little bit Amerindian, a little bit Indian, but those are the mixed people that they refer to most of the time. Yeah.
Will the WPA remain with the APDU coalition?
We are not part of the APNU. As you know, we left the APNU after the 2020 election on the issue of Mr. Granger and the APNU not treating us in a democratic and fraternal way. And so we left, and we have not rejoined the APNU. Now, we are in favor of coalition politics because we believe that that's the future of our country. And that this is nothing new. The WPA itself is a coalition of IPRA, Ratoon, Askria. Right. And in 1979, we came out with a government of national unity and reconstruction that calls for a power sharing government of all the parties except the PNC, because at that time we felt the PNC was the problem and could not be part of the solution. But Rodney did say, and Guyana reiterated it later, that the PNC that agrees to free and fair elections must be part of the solution. Hence, that logic took us into the APNU, the formation of the APNU with the PNC. But we were not satisfied with the way in which the APNU was managed. We were not satisfied with the way in which the coalition government managed its partners. Its partners did not play any role in decision-making outside of cabinet. And when you take the WPA, we had one voice in cabinet, which was could not be a small voice. But as a party, we were not consulted on policy like everybody else we read in the newspapers when the government was doing something. And so we left the APN, but we continue to believe in coalition politics. We feel that to maximize the returns for the opposition, it would be better to go in as a coalition of the PNC, the AFC, the WPA, and others, but we have not reached that point yet.
one of your members, I think her name is the Beetle, left the WPA and first joined APNU, then she formed her own party. Do you think you'll get her back to come back with the WPA?
Well, I can't answer that question. It would be up to her if she wants to come back in the WPA, and then up to the WPA whether it wants to accept her back into the party. But that's not a question that I can answer, because the circumstances in which she left, the circumstances in which she left were quite controversial, because Mr. Granger named her as the parliamentary representative, not on the instruction of the WPA. The WPA wanted to split the seat between Tabitha and another member of the party, and we communicated that to Mr. Granger. But Mr. Granger did not heed our advice. He named her, and that led to the split between us and the APNU.
Okay. Now, what was Walter Rodney's vision for the WPA? Do you know?
In what regard?
Politically.
Well, Walter Rodney believed that the solution to our problems was a government of national unity in which all races are represented in the government. He was very instrumental in putting together the document, the Government of National Unity and Reconstruction. And so at the center of Rodney's vision was the multiracial solution to the problems of our country. That remains a key position of the WPA, that we feel that we have to have a multiracial solution. Rodney, of course, was a Marxist, and so therefore working class liberation was very much part of his vision. That is, how do we eliminate poverty, for example, which is like a stranglehold around the necks of the poor. And so Rodney's vision include an unlocking of the energies of the poor people of the country and using government to uplift poor people, right? To get rid of things like poverty and to ensure that our people live a life that is not characterized by want, is not characterized by poverty. And so those were two of the very important building blocks of Rodney's vision. And it remains two important building blocks of our vision. Take, for example, the project that we have been campaigning on and we will campaign on this election. And that is the Buxton proposal that Professor Clive Thomas unveiled in 2018 on behalf of the WPA. And at the center of that vision is the eradication of poverty. We feel that if the government makes available in a legal and systematic way resources to the people of this country for them to decide how they want to use those resources, in addition to what the government chooses to do for them, you give them a chance to do for themselves. And that policy area is multiracial in nature, because we are saying give the resources to each household, regardless of race, regardless of class. It is for us the most democratic way of distributing the resources in our country. Because when you do infrastructure, as the government is doing, you're always going to face criticisms. Are you putting the bridge in an Indian area or an African area? Are you building better roads in Indian villages or African villages? When you do the contracts, who is benefiting from the contract? I'm saying all policies in a multi-ethnic society are subject to that ethnic scrutiny. But our policy of giving the cash transfer to each household, it is bereft of racial favoritism and class favoritism.
Now, let's go back to the topic, people. How the people are faring in Guyana, especially the poor, with the high cost of living, power blackouts. Every time I'm in Guyana, I go to the quarantine. There are power blackouts on a Friday for 3-4 hours, Saturday for the same thing, Sunday is the same thing. Every weekend almost, power blackouts occur in quarantine every day. And those who are listening to me cannot tell me that I'm criticizing the government. This got nothing to do with government. This is a fact. Every day there's a power blackout of the quarantine. And when power goes off, the water pumps don't work, people can't get water to bathe because they can't pump it upstairs. So something has to be done. But I say that to tell you, you tell me about the people in Guyana, how they're faring.
Well, you know, Guyana is a walking contradiction. I mean, our half-yearly report just showed that the oil section of the economy grew by 48.7%. In any part of the world, in any country, those numbers will be numbers to die for. All right? The non-oil economy rose by 12%. Numbers to die for, you see? However, when you go beyond those numbers and you look at whether those numbers are impacting the lives of the ordinary people, then another story is being told. The story of the poverty rate that ranges from 42% to 50%, depending on what numbers you use or which economists you talk to. The school dropout rate of 50%, the illiteracy rate that is apparently over 50% too. You look at the wages of public servants compared with wages in our sister CARICOM countries, way down the bottom. So Guyana is this walking contradiction of this shining city on the hill with this large growth rate. And then you look down into the valley and you see the suffering of the people in the valley. We in the Working People's Alliance think that it is a challenge of the next government to bridge the gap between that shining city on the hill and the degradation in the valley. That it is the role of government to ensure that our people benefit from the oil resources directly and indirectly. That we are not against infrastructure. We would support infrastructural development. But what are you building roads for? To attract investment from outside? Okay, fair enough. But investors are going to come to good roads. But are they going to come to a country that has blackout, as you were saying, every 2 minutes? What is your vision? What is your vision? If your vision is development, then that development will have to be a development that takes into consideration the condition of the people. Ultimately, for us in the Working People's Alliance, development is going to be about developing the people. If you're going to spend on infrastructure, if you're going to spend on hospitals, if you're going to spend on school buildings, these must contribute to the qualitative change in the lives of the people. If you're not doing that, then it's not development. And the Working People's Alliance says that whether we are part of a government or a government on our own, that is going to be our first line of action.
Let's turn to the other topic of this politics. How the politics is going in Guyana. What do you think about the politics in Guyana?
Well, the politics in Guyana, of course, have never been a friendly thing. Our politics have always been a politics of contention, a politics of ridicule, a politics of spite, and that politics continue. Unfortunately, the government of Guyana is not setting a good example in terms of developing a political culture that encourages people to be part of. You look at the way in which the government is treating the elites as opposed to the way it is treating the working people. You look at the way the government is treating its opponents. It's as if we have no place in Guyana. We are not consulted on anything. The parliament is controlled and railroaded by the government. The government threatens to lock up people, and they do lock up people at every twist and turn. The government, in the pursuit of what they are calling crossover votes, are really disrespecting the African Guyanese community by throwing things at them as the old slave masters used to do, to entice them to catch their fellow people and to carry them as victims to the PPP. It's really a dirty, stinking politics. If the PNC were to have done that to Indian Guyanese community, the PPP will not take it lightly. They will not, they will be up in arms over it. But the way in which they are discriminating racially and disrespecting the African Guyanese and the Amerindians, it's really bad politics, and it doesn't augur well for our future. So we really need, as a first line of defense, to change the government. That becomes imperative.
You know the attributes of good government, good governance. Do you think we have good governance in Guyana?
No, we don't. We don't. And one of the reasons that we don't have good governance in Guyana is that we don't have oversight. We don't have institutional oversight, because the parliament and the courts are supposed to be oversight of the executive branch. The parliament is not oversighting the executive branch because the parliament is controlled by the executive branch. The legislative branch is being held in limbo, being threatened every day by the AG, being called stupid jackasses and all kinds of things by the government. And so therefore, that branch is not carrying out its constitutional function of oversight. So there are no institutional oversight of the government. And any government, I don't care which part of the world, once there are no institutional oversight, then that government is moving down the road to bad governance, autocratic governance, and ultimately a dictatorship. Now, there are no institutional oversight. And where there are no institutional oversight, usually the people turn to non or extra parliamentary oversight. The government is using the force of the armed forces, the police. It has politicized the leadership of the police, the leadership of the army, and to use them to drive fear in the people so that they do not engage in extra parliamentary oversight. So there is no oversight inside of Guyana. And in the context of the geopolitics, oversight would normally come from countries like the United States, who would say, look, we can't have a country in our backyard behaving in this way. Bad governance and so forth. That has been a constant in American foreign policy. But when it comes to Guyana, the role that the US played and the Europeans to some extent, and the CARICOM leadership played in affecting the outcome of the last elections, it means that they have their government in power. And the oversight that they would normally give to a government that they don't have a political interest in, they do not have that oversight. So the government has no oversight from external forces, or little oversight, and no oversight internally. Bad government, autocratic government, and ultimately dictatorial government.
As we all know, corruption exists in all governments and a lot of institutions as well. But do you think corruption in Guyana is more, the same, or less than its sister nations in CARICOM?
Yes, yes. And the data shows that whenever the PPP has been in power, corruption grows. You know, you walk around. I hear little black girls and boys tell me, Dr. Hinds, when the PPP in power, money just run. And when you hear them little boys tell them money just run, you know what they're talking about, right? There is a way in which the PPP turns a blind eye to corruption at the bottom and facilitates corruption at the top. And I do not believe Mr. Jagdio wakes up in the morning and said, I want my government to run a corrupt country. I don't think that's how it works. But the PPP is concerned primarily with being in power. And it is doing anything that it takes to maintain that power. It turns a blind eye to corruption in the police force because it doesn't want to antagonize a police force that has traditionally not been supportive of it. It turns a blind eye to corruption among the Indian bourgeoisie because that Indian bourgeoisie, that Indian business class is very important to financing the PPP as a party. And so therefore, it's about you scratch my back, I scratch your back. And so the corruption in the country, both at the bottom and at the top of the ladder, being facilitated and encouraged by the PPP in exchange for its survival in office.
Okay, let me get to some other questions here. By the way, were you offered a job to teach at UG at any time?
No, I never applied to teach at UG.
Okay.
I tried to teach a couple of summers, but that never materialized. But UG has never asked me really to do anything. Recently, some professors have been asking me to do guest lectures in their classes, but as far as the administration, none of them has ever asked me. There was a time when I think on the Griffith, he had put together a team of academics from outside of Guyana. I was never asked to be part of that team. So no, UG has not been a place where I have done work.
You are a great and admirable fan of UC Guyana, Sidney King. Why?
Well, we're from the same village. He was largely responsible for attracting me to politics as a child, as a young person, and so therefore he, I would say, is my original mentor. But more than that, I find him to be a remarkable individual. I mean, outside of his politics and all of that. I spoke about Rodney's interest in us as individuals. Well, Guyana took that to the extreme, all right? The personal advice, the encouragement. He is one of those leaders by example. You will never be like Guyana. You will never be like Guyana. But you can take part of Guyana's example and carry it with you through life. Thanks to Guyana, I am not in love with political power. You know, PPP people, I still have people who I call friends in the PPP would say, David, man, you're driving a little old car. Oh, you don't come and let me give you a new car. You know, come and let me give you this. And I would laugh. And they would say, you're just like your leader. You never want anything. And yes, thanks to Guyana, I am not enticed by material things, nor enticed by power. And I do not know where I would be in terms of my public life, my public service without Guyana. He has been really instrumental and continues to be instrumental in my life as a public person.
Along the same lines, Did you like Burnham, Hoyt, Chady, or Janet?
I appreciated Burnham as, and still appreciate Burnham as a formidable person, a formidable leader by any stretch of the imagination. He was formidable. And everybody can be wrong. It doesn't matter which black village I go to. People see him as a superhero. And it's difficult to tell them that I don't see him as a superhero. All right? And so, therefore, yes, I admire Burnham. I've come to recognize Burnham as a formidable leader that you disagree with, but you cannot dismiss. I think a lot of people disagree with Burnham, but dismiss him as doing nothing good for the country. I think that is wrong. I continue to disagree with Burnham's policy, but I think Burnham has contributed tremendously to shaping Guyana's politics. His foreign policy in the 70s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, second to none. His domestic policy in terms of using government to uplift the poor is second to none, and he has to be given credit for those things. I think his supporters who believe that he's a superhero without faults are wrong. And his detractors who believe that he's a demon and a devil with nothing good about it, they're also wrong. I fall somewhere in the middle. Dr. Jagan, I think, is also a misunderstood leader. My friends Ravi Dev and Betoram Ramarag, they say Dr. Jagan didn't care about Indian people suffering, that he didn't use the Indian art, and they're wrong. They're wrong. That man cared about Indian people. Indian people wouldn't worship somebody who they feel didn't care about them. And if you go back and you look at his activism, he did speak about the Indian narrative of suffering. What Jagan was not, he was not an Indian supremacist. And my sneaking suspicion is that my brothers over there wanted him to be a supremacist. He was not an Indian supremacist, but he benefited from Indian mobilization. He loved Indian people, and he represented them and heard their cries. So I think Dr. Jagan is a misunderstood leader also. People talk about his Marxism and so on. And yes, at the level of international politics, that would have done some damage to himself, his party, and to Guyana. But I think that in terms of his domestic politics, he represented the poor, especially the Indian poor, with distinction. And he has no match in that regard. Now, Janet Jagan, I knew personally. She gave me one of my first jobs as a stringer for the Mirror newspaper. I wrote for the Mirror newspaper for about 2 years. Okay. I earned 10 cents per line, I remember. And so I had a close relationship at one point with Mrs. Jagan. She introduced me to Soviet literature because she found out that I was into literature. And I was part of the PPP's drama group called Worker Stage. Me, myself, and 2 brothers from Buxton. We left Buxton, we went to Freedom House, we walked in, and we said, we heard you all have a drama group. We are interested in multiracialism, and we want to join. Gail Teixeira was in charge of the drama group, and she admitted us. And we were part of the PPP's Worker Stage drama group for about 2 years. I want some of the Indian brothers and sisters who are listening to this program to hear me go tonight and hear my political history, all right? And so I became very close to Mrs. Jagan. Our relationship soured when the PPP came back to power. And I felt she was not very tolerant of the opposition. And I criticized her in a newspaper column that I was writing, and so our relationship soured. But I think she was a formidable woman. She was not, she took sides. And there are politicians who took sides, and she didn't hide the side that she took. Desmond Hoyt, I think, is one of the leaders in Guyana who does not get credit for his role. Desmond Hoyt was instrumental in the return of democracy, well, not return of democracy, let me take that back. He was instrumental in opening up the possibility for democratic change in Guyana. A lot of the extremities of the Burnham era, he broke them down. He gave the permission to open private newspapers, private television stations. He liberalized the economy. Some of us didn't like the way in which he liberalized it, but he liberalized the economy from a commandist economy. And in many regards, when we're talking about democratic governments in the post-Cold War era, Desmond Hoyt is extremely important in that regard, and he doesn't get as much credit. I do have place in my political analysis for Hoyt.
We are actually coming to the end of the program. I never expect an hour and a half to go by so fast, but you're very, very good at what you're doing. Now, taking the 5 years of Granger administration and the 4 years of the PP administration, and also taking into consideration the PP has a lot more revenue from oil than what the Granger administration had. But in a comparative analysis, how would you rate them?
Granger administration did something no other government has done in post-colonial Guyana. It put the brakes on human rights violations. The Burnham regime, and some of it continued a little bit under Hoyt, and certainly under the various PPP governments. Under Granger administration, extrajudicial killings almost stopped. Under the Granger administration, going and harassing opposition supporters and throwing them in jail for something they say on social media did not occur. Under the Granger administration, the rule of law was generally respected. There were instances where they violated the rule of law, but it was not a pattern. I'm talking about a pattern. So from a human rights standpoint, the Granger administration stands tall among administrations in Guyana. I want to make that emphatically clear. No. Did the Granger administration make mistakes? Yes. And its mistakes came from a lack of understanding of its reason for being. It is not very often that people give a government, a coalition government, a chance as they give the Granger government a chance. They broke a record of removing a government that was entrenched in power. And you handed power to this coalition. Therefore, the Guyanese people then had expectations of this coalition government. They had a clear sense of what they wanted from the government. The government didn't have a clear sense of what the people wanted it to do. And so it made some errors. The closing down of the sugar estates. Now, theoretically, was it correct? Yes, right-sizing sugar, taking sugar out from the stranglehold of politics, that was correct. But you are living in a society that is ethnically divided. And when you say sugar, you mean Indian. You mean Indian working people. And there are sensitivities that went with that. My leader at the time, one of my leaders at the time, Professor Clive Thomas, advised against closing the estates. I want to make that very clear, because some people just say Clive Thomas advised. No, Clive Thomas advised against closing the estates. But the government went ahead and closed the estate. I don't think the government meant to injure East Indians. I don't think they meant to alienate East Indians, but that was the outcome. That was the outcome, and that cannot be disregarded. So that was one instance in which it made mistakes. it made a mistake that I think cost it in the final analysis. The other big mistake I think the government made was not managing the coalition. At no time did the coalition government benefit from all of the talents in the parties in the coalition. It did not benefit from all the talents in the PNC because it never consulted the PNC. It never benefited fully from the talents of the WPA. It never consulted us. And so therefore, in terms of management of the coalition, the leaders of the coalition treated the coalition as a one-party government. And I think that was a fundamental error. And another error that I would think is the way it treated with its own constituency. That your constituency had been out of power for 23 years. And you have now come into power on their backs, and you didn't acknowledge them. You didn't say to them, you brought me to power, and there's some issues that are germane to you, that as a government, we will try to correct. Now, let me hasten to say, Ipadaji and the subvention, kudos to the Granger government. There was a RAID project that attempted to revitalize agriculture for African Guyanese communities. Kudos to them. But I think in the broader scheme of things, there is nothing lasting that African Guyanese can look at and say the coalition government did this for us. They can look back at Burnham and say, he did national service for us. He created Melanie Damishana and those housing schemes for us. He created the multilateral schools for us. They can point to lasting things as African Guyanese that Burnham did for them, not with the coalition. And so I think in that regard, the coalition faltered. The PPP government, I think, has really embarrassed our country. And I think they've become drunk with oil, and they've lost all moorings. They've lost all respect for the rule of law. They've lost all respect for a proper political culture. And as I said before, their modus operandi, their reason for being is to remain in power forever and forevermore. And they're prepared to destroy the Constitution, destroy the social and economic and political fabric of the country, to excite racial animosity. They're prepared to pay the price to do all of those things in order to remain in government. I do not think it's sustainable, and I fear for my country.
Thank you, Dr. Hinds. We have come to the end of the program, and now I would like to have your closing remarks.
Well, I would like to thank you for having me, Dr. Rose. I look at your program all the time, and I know you're a tough questioner. As we say, you come from out left field sometimes, and I notice how you get people basity and so on. And when you do these things over and over again, you get a little bit cocky and say, well, boy, I don't need to prepare. But I can tell you I prepared for today's interview because of the interviewer. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to coming back with part 2 sometime in the near future.
Yeah, we'd like to have you back here because you shed light on a number of issues, and I have more questions for you as well. But I know within 90 minutes we can't answer all the questions. I want to thank all our listeners for listening to us tonight, and our Mr. Noir Singh for making this program available, Devin Bissoon, Ryan Kissoon, and all our sponsors. A very special thank you to all of you, near and far. So thank you for listening. But before I go, I want to plug my booking again. It's called A Race to the Finish Line. The election of Barack Hussein Obama II as the first Black president of the United States. It's available on Amazon and all the bookstores you can think of. And it's paperback, so it's cheap now, $39.95. But by mid-November, it will go into hardcover and will be sold for over $200. because it is a comprehensive textbook on America's presidency. So I hope you all go and get it. Thank you very much. And again, thank you, Dr. Hinds, for coming on. It's been a pleasure having you, and you cleared up a number of issues. To all our listeners who send me a ton of questions, please bear in mind, I could not have asked all the questions. I managed to get 3 in, but I know I got about 64 questions. So don't think that I ignore you all, but I just can't get all the questions in. So thanks again to all of you. And again, Dr. Hinds, to you, thanks.
Thank you.
Stay in